I am Daniel Rhodes, 33 years old, and I teach history at Millbrook High School, in a town so small that everyone knows your business before you do. My life has always been measured in quiet moments, grading papers by lamplight, walking Emily through the town square on Sunday afternoons, listening to my grandfather George tell stories about the war. I thought I understood what contentment meant. I thought I had built something unshakable. Emily and I had been engaged for 3 years, planning our wedding with the careful attention of people who believed they had all the time in the world. She would sit at our kitchen table, surrounded by wedding magazines and color swatches, her blonde hair catching the morning light as she debated between ivory and cream. "What do you think, Danny?" she would ask, holding up fabric samples, and I would tell her she was beautiful in anything. Looking back, I wonder if I was too eager to please, too willing to let her lead while I followed in her wake. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a Tuesday evening in September. Grandpa George had collapsed in his kitchen in Savannah, and the doctor said his heart was finally giving out after 87 years of steady beating. I found Emily in the garden, deadheading the roses she had planted when we first moved in together. "I have to go," I told her, explaining about George, about how he had raised me more than my own parents ever had. "It might be weeks, maybe longer." She looked up at me with those green eyes that had first captured me in Professor Morrison's American Literature class 10 years ago. "Of course you have to go," she said, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. "He needs you." The morning I left, Emily drove me to the train station. She wore the blue dress I had bought her for her birthday, and she held my hand while we waited on the platform. "Take care of him," she whispered against my ear when the train arrived. "And take care of yourself." I kissed her forehead, breathed in the scent of her shampoo one last time, and climbed aboard. Through the window, I watched her wave until the station disappeared around a bend. I had no way of knowing it would be months before I saw her again, or that when I did, everything between us would be broken beyond repair. My brother Logan called that evening as the train pulled into Savannah. "Hey, big brother," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of charm and condescension. "Heard about Grandpa George. Tough break." He paused, and I could hear traffic in the background. "Listen, since you'll be gone a while, I'll check in on Emily. Make sure she's not getting lonely." At the time, I thought it was kind of him. Logan had always been the golden child, 6 years younger, and blessed with the kind of effortless confidence that made people gravitate toward him. "Thanks," I said. She'd appreciate that. If I had known then what I know now, I would have told him to stay away. But some storms, as Grandpa George would later tell me, arrive without warning, and all you can do is find shelter and wait for them to pass. 2 weeks into my stay in Savannah, something began to shift in Emily's voice during our nightly phone calls. The warmth that had always been there, the way she would ask about George's stories or tell me about her day at the accounting firm, started to feel rehearsed. Her laughter came a beat too late, and her questions about when I might return home carried an edge I couldn't quite place. "How's George doing?" she would ask, but I could hear her attention drifting even as I answered. Once, I caught the sound of a television in the background, some late-night comedy show, and realized she was only half listening as I described his declining condition. George himself was a study in dignity, even as his body betrayed him. He had served in the Pacific during World War II, and his small apartment was filled with photographs and letters from that time. "Your grandmother wrote me every week," he told me one afternoon, as I helped him organize his papers. "Never missed a Sunday. Even when the mail ships were late, and I'd get 3 letters at once, I could feel her love in every word." He paused, studying a faded photograph of a young woman with dark hair and bright eyes. "Some truths, son, aren't meant to be chased. They find you when you're ready to see them." I thought he was talking about death, about accepting his own mortality. I didn't understand that he was preparing me for a different kind of ending. The first real warning came through Facebook, of all places. Emily had posted a photo from what looked like a dinner out. Candles on the table, wine glasses, the kind of romantic setting we used to share. But she was laughing at something off camera, and in the background, barely visible, I could see Logan's reflection in the restaurant window. I stared at that photo for longer than I care to admit, zooming in on details, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. When I called Emily that night, I mentioned seeing the photo. "Oh, that," she said, and I could hear her moving around, probably tidying the kitchen the way she always did when she was nervous. "Logan took me out to cheer me up. I was feeling lonely with you gone." "That was thoughtful of him," I said, though something cold had settled in my chest. "He's been really supportive," she continued, stopping by to check on things, helping with some repairs around the house. "You should be grateful to have such a caring brother." I should have been grateful. Instead, I felt something I had never experienced before, a quiet alarm, like smoke drifting under a door. Emily had never needed cheering up before. She had always been the steady one, the one who kept us both grounded. That night, I wrote her a long letter by hand, the way George had taught me, telling her how much I missed her and asking if everything was really okay between us. I mailed it the next morning and waited for her response. The letter came back unopened 2 weeks later, marked "Return to Sender" in Emily's careful handwriting. The phone call came on a Thursday evening while I was reading to George from one of his war memoirs. Emily's voice was different, cleaner somehow, as if she had rehearsed what she was going to say. "Daniel, we need to talk," she began, and I knew, with the certainty of someone who has been dreading this moment, that my world was about to collapse. "I've been thinking a lot while you've been gone, and I think we've grown apart. We want different things." I set the book down carefully, George watching me with those knowing eyes that had seen too much of life's cruelties. "What are you saying, Emily?" "I'm saying I can't do this anymore. The engagement, the wedding plans. It all feels wrong. I'm sorry, Daniel, I really am." Her words came out in a rush, practiced and final. I wanted to argue, to ask her to wait until I came home so we could talk face to face, but something in her tone told me the decision had already been made long before this call. "Is there someone else?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "I'm returning the ring," she said finally. "I'll mail it to your apartment." After she hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of George's living room, staring at the phone in my hand. George reached over and patted my shoulder with a trembling hand. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." The confirmation came 3 days later through a mutual friend's careless social media post. Sarah Chen, Emily's college roommate, had shared a photo from what looked like a weekend getaway, mountain views, hiking trails, and there in the center of it all were Emily and Logan, his arm around her waist, both of them grinning at the camera with the easy intimacy of people who had been together for months, not days. The caption read, "So happy for these two lovebirds, finally made it official." I stared at that photo until my eyes burned. Logan was wearing the same confident smile he had worn our entire childhood, the one that said he had won something I didn't even know we were competing for. Emily looked radiant in a way I hadn't seen in months, her face bright with a kind of joy that felt like a knife between my ribs. George found me that evening sitting on his small balcony, watching the sun set over the Savannah River. He had grown weaker in recent days, but he made his way outside and settled into the chair beside me. "You know what I learned in the war," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who can hurt you the most. Not because they're evil, but because they're weak. And weakness makes people do terrible things to the ones who love them." 2 weeks later, George died peacefully in his sleep. I held his hand as he passed, thinking about betrayal and weakness and the weight of loving people who don't know how to love you back. At his funeral, I was the only family member who came. Logan sent flowers with a card that read, "Sorry for your loss, brother." Returning to North Carolina felt like walking through a museum of my own life. Everything looked exactly the same. The tree-lined streets, the brick buildings of downtown, the high school where I had taught for 8 years. But I was different, hollowed out in ways that made familiar places feel foreign. I drove past the house Emily and I had shared, the one with the blue shutters and the garden where she used to tend her roses. A different car sat in the driveway now, and I could see through the kitchen window that someone had painted the walls a color we had never chosen together. She had moved on completely, erasing any trace of our shared life with the efficiency of someone who had been planning her exit long before I knew there was a door. The cruelest blow came when I stopped at Meredith's Bakery for coffee, the same place where Emily and I used to go every Saturday morning. Through the front window, I saw them, Logan and Emily, sitting at what had been our usual table. She was leaning forward, laughing at something he was saying, her hand resting on his arm with casual intimacy. Logan caught sight of me through the glass and had the audacity to wave, as if we were old friends who had simply run into each other. I didn't wave back. I got in my car and drove home to the small apartment I was renting until I could figure out what came next. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday, addressed in Emily's careful handwriting, ivory cardstock, expensive printing, all the details we had once discussed for our own ceremony. Logan Rhodes and Emily Carson request the honor of your presence, it read, and at the bottom, in smaller script, family and close friends only. I stared at that invitation for a long time, wondering if I qualified as either anymore. My mother called that evening. "I hope you're not planning to make trouble," she said without preamble. Ellen Rhodes had never been one for small talk, especially when it came to uncomfortable family matters. Logan is finally settling down with a good woman. Emily's perfect for him. Perfect for him, I repeated, the words tasting bitter. You know what I mean, Daniel. Logan knows how to hold on to things. He's always been more decisive than you. Her voice carried that familiar note of disappointment, the same tone she had used when comparing my quiet nature to Logan's flashy confidence throughout our childhood. Besides, Emily seems much happier now. Sometimes things just work out the way they're supposed to. After she hung up, I sat in my empty apartment, surrounded by boxes I hadn't yet unpacked, and realized that I had lost more than just my fiancée. I had lost my place in my own family, relegated to the role of obstacle to everyone else's happiness. The next morning, my phone rang. Maya Jensen's name appeared on the screen, my colleague from school, someone I had barely spoken to beyond polite hallway conversations. "Daniel," she said when I answered, "I heard you were back. Would you like to get coffee sometime? I think we might have more in common than you realize." Quote, telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya Jensen taught chemistry at our high school, and in all our years working in the same building, I had never really seen her, not the way you see someone when you're paying attention. She was quiet, competent, the kind of person who did her job well without seeking recognition. When we met for coffee at a small cafe across town, away from the places where Emily and I had made memories, I realized she had the same careful way of speaking that comes from having your words measured and found wanting by people who should have treasured them. "My ex-fiancé left me for my sister," she said without preamble as we settled into a corner booth, 2 years ago. The whole family sided with them because my sister was finally happy, and I was apparently too serious, too focused on my career. She stirred her coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into patterns. "I know that look you've been wearing, Daniel, the one that says you're wondering what you did wrong." I hadn't expected such directness, but it was exactly what I needed. Someone who understood the particular weight of family betrayal. "How do you get past it?" I asked. "You don't get past it," she said simply. "You get through it. And you learn that some people will always choose the easier story, the one that makes them feel better about standing by and watching someone they're supposed to love get destroyed." Over the following weeks, Maya and I began meeting regularly. Not dates exactly, but something more honest than that. Two people who had been hollowed out by betrayal, learning to trust again. She helped me see that my silence wasn't weakness, as my mother had always suggested, but a kind of strength that Logan had never possessed. "You process things," Maya observed one evening as we walked through the school's empty hallways after a late faculty meeting. "You think before you speak, consider before you act. That's not weakness, Daniel, that's wisdom." It was Maya who suggested I start writing again. I had kept journals in college but stopped after Emily and I got together, too caught up in building our life to reflect on it. Now I found myself filling notebook after notebook, not with anger or plans for revenge, but with memories of George, reflections on loyalty, and slowly, carefully, thoughts about what kind of man I wanted to be moving forward. In one of George's books, tucked between pages about Normandy, I found a letter he had written but never sent. "Some storms," it read in his careful script, "you ride through by holding tight to what you know is true. Others, you must name aloud before they can pass." When the wedding invitation had been sitting on my kitchen table for 2 weeks, Maya finally asked, "Are you going to go?" I looked at her across my small living room, this woman who had shown me that healing didn't require forgetting, that strength could be quiet without being weak. "Yes," I said, "I think I am." "Good," she said. "It's time you had your say." The RSVP card sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I filled it out. One guest I wrote in careful block letters and dropped it in the mailbox before I could change my mind. Part of me wondered if they would actually want me there, or if the invitation had been sent out of some twisted sense of family obligation. Either way, I was going to find out. The annual Rhodes family barbecue had always been held the weekend before any major family event, a tradition my mother insisted on despite the fact that we barely functioned as a family anymore. This year, it served as an unofficial engagement party for Logan and Emily. I showed up wearing a simple button-down shirt and khakis, carrying a bottle of wine I had picked up at the grocery store. Logan held court on the back deck, regaling my cousins and their wives with stories about his latest business ventures. He had always been good at making himself the center of attention, but now there was something different about him, a smugness that went beyond his usual confidence. Emily stood beside him, beautiful in a sundress I had never seen before, laughing at his jokes with the kind of enthusiasm that seemed performed for an audience. "There's the big brother," Logan called out when he spotted me, raising his beer in a mock toast. "Glad you could make it back from your little sabbatical." The conversation around the deck went quiet. Everyone knew what had happened, but nobody had acknowledged it directly. I nodded and moved toward the kitchen, where my mother was arranging platters with military precision. "You came," she said without looking up from the potato salad. "You invited me. I wasn't sure you would." She finally met my eyes, and I saw something there that might have been guilt if she had been capable of it. "Logan was worried you might try to cause trouble." "What kind of trouble would I cause, Mom?" She waved her hand dismissively. "You know how you get when you're upset, all quiet and brooding. It makes people uncomfortable." Through the kitchen window, I could see Logan with his arm around Emily's waist, whispering something in her ear that made her blush. "Unlike Logan, who's the picture of consideration," I said. "Logan is finally happy, Daniel. Emily brings out the best in him. Sometimes you have to accept that things work out the way they're supposed to." I left the barbecue early, but not before overhearing Logan telling my cousin Mark about how he had rescued Emily from a boring life with a boring man. The laughter that followed his comment felt like a physical blow. Pastor Coleman caught up with me in the driveway as I was getting into my car. William Coleman had baptized both Logan and me, officiated at dozens of family weddings, and had the kind of gentle authority that came from decades of helping people through their worst moments. "Sometimes, Daniel," he said, placing a weathered hand on my shoulder, "silence is the loudest truth we can speak, but there comes a time when even the quietest among us must find their voice." He squeezed my shoulder and walked back toward the house, leaving me to wonder if he somehow knew what I was planning. I arrived at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church 30 minutes before the ceremony, wearing the charcoal suit I had bought for my own wedding that would never happen. The afternoon sun filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored light across the polished pews already filling with guests. I chose a seat in the back, close to the aisle, where I could see everything but remain relatively unnoticed. The whispers started as soon as people recognized me. I caught fragments of conversations. "Can't believe he came. Awkward situation, poor guy." But I kept my eyes forward, my hands folded in my lap, breathing the way George had taught me during his worst pain episodes. In through the nose, out through the mouth, steady and controlled. Logan appeared at the altar in a tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than I made in a month, flanked by his groomsmen who looked like they had stepped out of a catalog. He scanned the crowd with that familiar swagger, his eyes finding mine for just a moment. Instead of looking uncomfortable, he winked. Actually winked, as if my presence was amusing rather than threatening. The organ began playing, and Emily appeared at the back of the church on her father's arm. She looked beautiful, radiant even, in a dress that was everything we had once discussed for our own ceremony. Strapless, flowing, with delicate beadwork that caught the light as she moved. But as she walked down the aisle, her eyes swept across the gathered guests, and when they found me, her step faltered. For just a moment, her composure cracked. I saw something in her face, guilt, fear, maybe regret, before she recovered and continued toward Logan, who was beaming with the confidence of a man who had gotten everything he wanted. Pastor Coleman stood at the altar, his weathered face serene as he waited for the bride to reach her destination. He had performed this ritual hundreds of times, but I wondered if he had ever presided over a ceremony built on such a foundation of betrayal. The service proceeded with all the traditional pomp. Logan and Emily exchanged rings, recited vows about love and faithfulness and commitment, their voices carrying across the sanctuary with practiced ease. I listened to Emily promise to honor and cherish Logan, the same words she had once rehearsed for our own wedding, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Pastor Coleman raised his hands and looked out over the congregation. "Dearly beloved," he said in his resonant voice, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Logan and Emily in holy matrimony. If any person has reason why these two should not be wed, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The church fell silent. Not even the rustle of fabric or the clearing of a throat disturbed the stillness. Pastor Coleman's eyes found mine across the sanctuary, and in that moment I understood that this was my crossroads. I could remain silent, forever holding my peace, or I could finally speak the truth that had been growing inside me like a weight I could no longer carry. I stood up. The silence that followed my standing was absolute. I could feel every eye in the sanctuary on me, could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath from 3 rows ahead. Logan's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and Emily stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "I have something to say," I said, my voice carrying farther than I had expected in the hushed church. Pastor Coleman nodded slightly, giving me permission to continue. I walked to the center aisle, not rushing, taking the time to find the words that had been forming in my heart for months. When I spoke again, it was not with anger or accusation, but with the quiet authority of someone who had finally found his voice. "I want to tell you about my grandfather, George," I began, looking not at Logan or Emily, but at the assembled guests. "He served in the Pacific during World War II, and every Sunday for 3 years my grandmother wrote him letters. Even when the mail ships were late, even when she didn't know if he was alive or dead, she wrote. She kept her promise." The congregation was utterly still. I could see confusion on some faces, understanding dawning on others. George kept every one of those letters until the day he died. He told me once that in war, you learn who keeps their word and who breaks it when things get difficult. He said the difference between honor and dishonor isn't how you act when people are watching. It's what you do when you think no one will ever know. My eyes found Emily's then, and I saw tears beginning to form. Logan started to take a step forward, but Pastor Coleman raised a gentle hand to stop him. "I've been quiet for a long time," I continued. "Some people mistake silence for weakness, but silence is where we find the words that matter most. It's where we decide what kind of person we want to be when the storm passes." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the sanctuary, taking in my mother's stricken face, my cousin's uncomfortable expressions, the strangers who had come to witness what they thought would be a celebration. "George taught me that some storms you ride through by holding tight to what you know is true. Others you must name aloud before they can pass, so I'm naming this one." I looked directly at Logan now, my voice steady and clear. "A man who would take what belongs to his brother, while that brother tends to their dying grandfather, is not a man who understands love. He understands conquest." The murmur that rippled through the church was quickly silenced as I continued. And a woman who would make promises to one man while breaking them with another doesn't understand love either. She understands convenience. I turned back to Pastor Coleman, who was watching me with something that looked like approval. That's all I had to say, I told him. I'll forever hold my peace now. The silence that followed was deafening. I walked back up the aisle, past the shocked faces and whispered conversations, and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, finally free of the weight I had been carrying. I made it to the parking lot before Emily caught up with me. I heard her calling my name, the rustle of her dress as she ran across the gravel in her wedding shoes. When I turned around, her face was streaked with tears, her carefully applied makeup running in dark lines down her cheeks. "Daniel, please," she said, breathless from running. "Please, just wait." I stopped beside my car but didn't turn to face her fully. Through the church windows, I could see the silhouettes of guests still standing in the sanctuary, Pastor Coleman attempting to restore order to a ceremony that had been shattered beyond repair. "What do you want me to say, Emily?" I asked, my voice emptied of everything I had carried for so long. "I want you to know that I never meant for it to happen this way." Her words came out in a rush, desperate and raw. "Logan, he was just there when you were gone, and he made me feel—" She stopped, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I felt so alone, Daniel. You were always so far away, even when you were right beside me." I finally turned to look at her, this woman who had been the center of my world for so many years. In her wedding dress, with her hair perfectly styled and her face ruined by tears, she looked like a stranger wearing a costume of someone I used to love. "So you chose Logan," I said simply. "I didn't choose him over you. I chose feeling alive over feeling forgotten." She was crying harder now, her voice breaking. "But standing in there, listening to you talk about promises and honor, I realized—" She covered her face with her hands. "I think I married the wrong brother." The words hung between us like a bridge I could have crossed back to her, back to the life we had planned together. 6 months ago, maybe even 6 weeks ago, hearing her say those words would have undone me completely. I would have taken her in my arms, forgiven everything, convinced myself that love could overcome betrayal. Instead, I felt nothing but a profound sadness for the woman who had once been my everything, and was now asking me to rescue her from a choice she had made with open eyes. "No, Emily," I said quietly. "You married exactly the man you chose. Logan is charming and exciting and present, everything you said you wanted. The problem isn't that you chose wrong, it's that you chose for the wrong reasons." She looked up at me with desperate eyes. "What am I supposed to do now?" "You're supposed to live with your choice," I told her, "the way I've learned to live with mine." I got in my car and drove away, leaving Emily standing in the parking lot in her wedding dress. In my rearview mirror, I could see Logan emerge from the church, his face a mask of barely controlled rage as he walked toward his crying bride. I didn't look back again. 6 months later, I stood on the pier in Savannah, where George used to take his evening walks, watching the sun set over the river he had loved so much. The city had become my home, in a way North Carolina never quite managed to be. I had taken a position at Savannah Country Day School, teaching history to students who actually seemed interested in learning about the past instead of simply enduring it. The apartment I rented was small but comfortable, filled with George's books and photographs, the tangible remnants of a life lived with honor. I had inherited more than just his possessions. I had inherited his understanding that dignity was something you carried within yourself, not something others could give or take away. Maya visited every few weekends, driving down from North Carolina with her easy laugh and her ability to make silence feel companionable rather than empty. We had grown closer, slowly, carefully, two people who had learned that trust was something to be rebuilt brick by brick rather than offered wholesale. "You seem different," she had told me on her last visit as we walked through Forsyth Park in the early morning, settled, but not in a defeated way. "More like you finally found where you belong." She was right. The weight I had carried for so long, the weight of other people's expectations, of trying to be someone I wasn't, of loving people who didn't know how to love me back, had finally lifted. I no longer checked social media for updates about Logan and Emily's marriage, no longer wondered if my mother had forgiven me for speaking the truth at their wedding. Those concerns belonged to a different version of myself, one who had confused silence with weakness and kindness with obligation. That afternoon, I had given a lecture to my advanced placement students about Civil War correspondence, reading them letters written by soldiers to their wives and sweethearts. Notice, I had told them, how the most powerful words often come from the quietest voices. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. One of my students, a thoughtful girl named Sarah, who reminded me of myself at that age, had raised her hand. "Mr. Rhodes, do you think silence can ever be more powerful than speaking up?" I had smiled, thinking of George, of Pastor Coleman, of the moment I stood up in that church and finally found my voice. Sometimes, Sarah, silence is how we gather our strength. But there comes a time when even the quietest among us must speak, not out of anger or revenge, but because the truth deserves to be heard. As the last light faded over the Savannah River, I pulled out my phone and saw a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without reading, but something made me pause. It was from Emily. "I wanted you to know that Logan and I are getting divorced. You were right about everything. I hope you're happy now." I read the message twice, then deleted it without responding. Her story was no longer mine to read, just as my happiness was no longer hers to define. I put my phone away and walked home through the Spanish moss and gaslight, finally free. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot. 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Document tabs. Tab 1. Headings you add to the document will appear here.